Good evening. My name is Ruth van Reken, and I am the co-author of Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. I want to welcome you to Third Culture Kids Greece. I am so excited that Rahina and Patrice have made this possible and that you have accepted their invitation to come and be present this evening. If I could be with you, I certainly would. I would love to be. But since that's not possible, I wanted to at least say hello and thank you for coming. And I know that you're going to have and are having a great time. A little bit about my history. I am a U.S. American who was born and raised in Nigeria. My father was a U.S. American born and raised in Iran. I raised my three children in Liberia. One of them was born there, and my first granddaughter was born in Ghana. So you can see why this topic of people who are raising children in global transition really is important to me. I've been working with the topic for about 30 years, and it came about when I was trying to figure out why, with the wonderful life that I had, and I loved my life, I loved growing up overseas, but why with this incredible life, there were still these places that struggle with depression and sadness and things that other people didn't really see, but I couldn't understand them about my own story. And so I started doing some journaling, which became my first book, Letters Never Sent. And through that, I began to touch the fact that the very goodness of my life had probably kept me from looking at some of the losses, because this is a life where we have so much mobility. We're always saying hello. We're always saying goodbye. And so that was how this started for me. Then I met Dave Pollock, who had developed what he called the Third Culture Kid profile. And somehow or another, I offered to help him write it up, and that was how the book ultimately came to be. Rahina's asked me to talk a little bit about relationships and the challenge of relationships sometimes for adult TCKs or other types of cross-culture kids. This is a great challenge because of two things. If you really know the story of the adult third culture kid profile, basically there are two main elements. We have the cross-cultural piece, and then we also have the mobility piece. The cross-cultural piece, of course, takes us from place to place where the cultural rules are always changing. And if you think about identity, we usually form it in relationship to our surroundings. We have the mirror around us. We have parents, we have friends, we have a neighborhood, and we start to learn the rules and we know where we belong. And that's what gives us that sense ultimately of this is who I am, this is where I belong, these are my people. But for those who are chronically moving, those cultural mirrors change. And so after a while, we may look like the people around us, particularly when we try to re-enter and go back to our passport country. But we don't think like them. We've been in a different experience. So people look at us and they assume that we are like others, and we are alike as being human beings, but we haven't had the same experiences. And so sometimes we can have a cross-cultural issue that we don't even know about, where we assume that we're in the same kind of relationship or the same cultural affinity, and we aren't. So that's one piece of it. But really, the biggest reason I see for relationship challenges is the mobility. As you hopefully know, when you do mobility, you go through a transition cycle every time. Both you as the person leaving and the people who are staying, or if you're the one staying, you can experience also when people are leaving. In our lifestyle, people are coming and going all the time, even if we aren't, or coming and going. And when that happens, first, before we move, we're in a state of what Dave Pollock called involvement, where you know the people know you, you know how the place works. But then the day comes, you hear that you're going to move. And we start to go through the leaving stage. And in this stage, people begin to withdraw. And this is where I'm sure all of you have experienced that you know you're leaving, or you know a friend is leaving. And so you start to pull back. And a lot of times I didn't like people before they left. I just figured, I don't even know why we're friends anymore, because we're trying to protect ourselves. Then you go through the transition phase itself. You've left one place, you're not really in the next place, and you're kind of in no man's land. And it's a time where you can feel the loss of what you've left. You still don't have the new place yet. And so it can be chaotic. It can be a sad time. It can be a time where you wonder if you made a big mistake. When we were children, it's probably the time we felt anger towards our parents, that they were moving us sometimes against our will. But then you go into a reentry and you decide, maybe I will enter, I will make it in the new place, and then we go into involvement. The problem for many TCKs is that we do it so many times that we start to protect. We start to get a wall right about here. And we can jump into relationships, but we only go internally so far. When I was first married, I didn't know anything about this, but I couldn't figure out why, as soon as I got close to my husband, I would fuss about something. I would make some kind of argument, some kind of whatever. I didn't know why, but I realize now I was afraid that if I got too close and then he left or something happened, he died, I wouldn't be able to stand it. I basically spent my life getting ready to say goodbye. That's not a healthy way to live, either with friendships or with particularly close partnerships, because often we create our own chaos and we don't even know why we're doing it. And then we blame other people, we blame the situation, and that can be a problem. Another thing, even about friendships, is that we kind of have a different style. I think most of you know that in this lifestyle of global mobility, often we have friends that we may not see for a long time, but when we see them again, we just pick right up. And so we have a different pattern than people around us may have, who expect us to call every day. And I know I've offended many people here, I'm sure in the US, who think I'm not being a good enough friend because I don't contact them often enough. And I feel like, oh, but if you're my good friend, when I see you, and we'll be friends. So there are some real challenges to relationships. And I think in terms of what we do about that, first we can recognize that a lot of times when we lose something, we do go through a grief cycle. A cycle where often we feel, first we're in denial, then we maybe feel angry about the loss, or we start to get depressed. Then we can kind of bargain and eventually come to acceptance again. That was what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about. But I think what happens for a lot of us when we're adults, if we did not process our losses when they happened, and this was my story, I got stuck in unresolved grief, because we will feel grief when we leave somebody we love, or some things we love, the place we love, the country we love. And if we don't have a way to mourn, a way to process like a funeral, then it just goes someplace. And what I realized for myself, and I think for many people, is there's 4 reasons that we don't process it well. One thing, we don't even recognize our losses. I used to read so many books about depression, and none of them talked about what was my life. I didn't have alcoholic parents. Nobody was divorced. They loved me. I loved them. I had a good home life. I loved my childhood. But what I came to realize when I did the journaling that became my first book was that when I left Nigeria, it was the death of my world. But nobody saw it as my world because, of course, I'm an American. And so I should be happy to be going back to my grandmother and my family. And so these things were invisible losses. I had a place in Nigeria. I knew who I was. I knew how I functioned. I got back to the States and I didn't know how the world worked. So I'd lost my status, or I'd lost, my past. So there are all kinds of invisible losses we have. And so that's one thing. We didn't recognize even what we lost. But another thing is we have a lack of permission. I don't know about you, but I know for me, when I would feel sad, people would try and cheer me up. They would say, well, just think about how much good your parents are doing, or all the wonderful experiences you have. And they were true. that I believe those. So then why do I feel sad? So I didn't really have permission to grieve. We also didn't have a lot of time. Now, in today's world, especially, people just take airplane rides back and forth. We used to take at least a boat ride. I'm from a very old time. But there's no time to really process it. And if you think about the death of a person, we give time. We have a wake, we have a funeral. Nobody expects you to be cheerful right away. But in this process, when we've lost our world, when we've lost our best friends, when we've lost whatever, because it's invisible, people don't, there's no way to really honor that loss. And so we don't have time. We don't have permission. We don't even know what we've lost. And we don't have comfort. Comfort is different than encouragement. I think a lot of people try to encourage me and say things like, well, just think about all the other kids who, don't have a home or don't have a mommy. And my parents were on the other side of the ocean during my high school. And so I should just be glad at least I had parents. Well, I was glad I had parents, but that didn't really help the pain in my heart for the loss. So when people say, what is it we're supposed to do? One of the most important things for today, if you're going to leave, is to learn how to say goodbye well. Because a lot of times we run away from saying goodbye because we don't want it to hurt. But Dave Pollock talks about building a raft where the R is for reconciliation. If we have relationships, especially ones we've kind of messed up, as we're getting ready to go, to say sorry and to make sure as best we can we leave with our relationships intact, because if you come back, you don't want to have somebody you can't stand to see or you're afraid that they won't like you. Then affirmation, saying thank you. Saying thank you to the people. And if you're a parent, this is something you should be helping your children with. Who do they want to say thank you to? Who's been important in their life while they're here? And so we say thank you, and then we say farewell. Dave always talked about saying farewell to people and to places and to pets and to possessions. The people maybe is obvious. We could write notes, we can have a party, we can do things like that. But to places, can we go take a picture? Can we go, sometimes kids take little rocks from a place that was precious. But going back and saying goodbye to a place that really holds our memories, that's important. And then if you have pets that you can't take, making sure that children we don't just take them away, or that we say goodbye, make sure they have a good home. And then possessions, there's things that each of us have that are precious because they are a part of that memory. And so it's important, if we can, to take what we call these sacred objects as part of our history. But then to say goodbye, maybe if you have something you can't take, find somebody who would value it or take pictures again of that. And then he talks about thinking destination. We do need to think about where we're going and get ready for it. And that can be part of the move. But not before we've said goodbye. Too often we think about the destination and we get excited, but we haven't said goodbye properly yet. So that's if you're doing it now. But for those of us who did it a long time ago and it's gone, we don't know what to do. There's several things we can do to deal with this kind of a grief, so we don't have to push everybody away trying to not feel grief. It's okay to go through saying goodbye and to cry some, and then we can get through it like we do at a funeral. So for me, I'm a writer, so I wrote, and that's how I did letters, and I write my things and I process. And for me, when I did letters, it was like I went back in time to that moment, and I started to write as the little girl who was at boarding school, and finding words as an adult to name my losses. That was important for me. But other people paint. Some people write music. But there's some way to go back and acknowledge, that it was a loss. And I want to say something. People say to me, why do I talk about grief? I say, you don't grieve for something if you didn't love it. My grief was actually an affirmation of the wonderful childhood I had. I just didn't know how to say goodbye to it when it happened. So we can say goodbye later. It's not past. Somehow time can telescope and we can do that. But I think also we call it journey of clarification, sometimes going back to that place and seeing that, yes, it's there, but it's not the way it was. You can say goodbye even later. But the biggest thing I think is realizing that there's a reason for how I felt. I wasn't crazy because I felt this sadness. I wasn't alone. I began to find out many other people had my experience. Then I also began to be able to use it. I am a third culture kid, an adult third culture kid, but people with different experiences also have loss, and they also have identity issues. And so the more I knew about my story and was not afraid then to look at my story and to deal with the things that were in it, the more I was able to help other people, I think, to say, well, you have a different story, but we're both human beings, and loss is loss, and maybe you didn't look at your story also. Then what I see is when I'm willing to look at that place, the place where the grief is stored is also the place where the joy is stored. I think our feelings are kind of in the same place. I can't tell you, once I stopped being afraid of looking at the sadness, I could feel the joy in a way I had never felt before. I could use my story. I could work with it because I didn't have to keep it separated from me. And I guess that's been the wonderful thing about my life is that what I do, I've gone to over 50 countries now talking to parents and teachers and kids, and it all comes out of my story. It doesn't come from a fancy degrees, but it comes from the fact that we have a story that is a rich one. I wouldn't trade my life for anyone's because of the joy, the people I have known from so many places and so many continents. And so it's important for us to deal with the losses so that we can really, really celebrate the gains. There's a great song by a country and western singer here, Garth Brooks, and the first time I heard it, I thought, oh, that's my TCK song. In that recording called The Dance, it's a country and western, so of course they're always sort of sad songs. But there's this beautiful girl he meets, and he dances with her, and he has this great time. And then he says, of course she leaves, and he said, if I had known how it was going to end, would I have, still danced with her? And then he says, I could have missed the pain, but I'd have had to miss the dance. When I think about my life, even the places of learning to deal with loss have been such a gift to me because even that makes my life rich. It makes my life full as I consider the beauty of these things in my life that, yes, they may not be there anymore. I love the African sky. I love the friends I had. I love climbing trees I had. I love going to market. Maybe I don't get to do that all the time, but it's added such a richness. It's added so many bricks in my life that I can build other things on later. So I'm happy to be a third culture kid, to have grown up that way. It's not the only thing I am, but it's a great heritage. And I hope that as you're here talking about these things, you too will find a richness that you belong to a group that understand your story, that really can empathize with it, and that you'll just plain have a lot of fun being together and sharing these things. So thanks for coming, and I hope to see you in person someday. Bye-bye.